All right, Bill Chalker.
Hi, how are you, Jack?
I'm good, mate. Thank you very much for being in here.
No worries.
I'm very excited to be speaking with you. I feel like across all of Australia, you are the UFO guy.
Yep.
Yeah?
Yeah, the good, bad, and the ugly of it all.
Yeah, the good, bad, and the ugly. You've got
Ma-
an
ma-
impressive CV.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot. You've experienced a lot. I've read a little bit about you. I saw. Well, first of all, you're born and raised in Grafton, right?
Yep.
Okay. And my understanding is that your interest in UFOs began with a series of UFO sightings in Grafton.
Yep.
So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first of them that attracted my attention, I actually wasn't a direct participant, but back in 1966, which was in retrospect a really big year internationally on the UFO scene, and also a huge wave, what I call a huge wave flap year in UFO jargon in Australia as well. And as it turned out, in terms of international and local reporting, there were UFO sightings occurring on the north coast of New South Wales, and the main witnesses, as it turned out, were police officers.
Yeah, right.
And they were chasing UFOs around the countryside, both in and around Grafton, Casino, and Lismore. They were the main focuses of the whatever was occurring kind of stuff. Some of it might have been caused by misinterpretations of things like Venus and stuff like that, but so much of it.
Misinterpretations of Venus?
Yeah, one of the they call it the queen of the UFO sometimes. Venus, as a planet, it's one of the brightest objects in our night sky, and you see they call it the evening star or the morning star kind of stuff. So it's always pretty close to the horizon.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't throw shit at the police and stuff like that in terms of misinterpreting, because there was a really interesting episode back during World War II. There was a US warship that thought there were Japanese aircraft coming in to bomb their aircraft, so they fired off about 2,000 rounds, and then after about 5 minutes they realised that this thing wasn't coming any closer because it turned out to be the planet Venus. So,
yeah, right.
So it can be extremely bright, and pilots in particular have often mistaken Venus for the landing lights of aircraft and that kind of stuff. So that's how bright it can be. It's so it's pretty inevitable that might create a few UFO sightings. But in the case of the police at Grafton and Lismore and Casino, there were some pretty strange events going on, almost like close encounters where objects were coming up pretty close to the vehicles, and paddock hopping and going from paddock to paddock, sort of literally landing in paddocks and that kind of stuff and taking off. So it was a pretty interesting period. And so a part of this story, and only part of it really, turned up in the newspapers, and it became actually an international story. It was actually picked up by the early wire services, and accounts of it were appearing in US papers and English papers. So, yeah, a lot of interest.
Wow.
But unfortunately, he's this kid, young teenager, starting to take a bit of an interest in unusual things kind of stuff. I didn't happen to see it, but it seemed like half of Grafton were seeing UFOs, but not me. But it was enough to spark my interest in it.
So it seems like over time, the interest in UFOs has kind of gained more attention.
Absolutely.
Which that, like, in a way kind of has you asking questions, because, is it just a phase? Like, is it something that people are kind of, following as opposed to genuinely seeing and,
right.
Yeah,
well, I could sort of talk to that, because really the main modern sort of appearance of UFOs can be backed up to 1947 was the key year that Kenneth Arnold, a pilot in Washington State, saw 9 objects fast moving. He was actually searching for a downed aircraft. There was a reward going on for a lost plane and the crew, and so any pilots that were operating in the area were obviously on the lookout for this downed aircraft, not only obviously to rescue the people or whatever, or to find them at least anyway. And he saw these 9 fast-moving objects, etc., and clocked them at pretty phenomenal speed, and that's what kicked off the whole UFO thing. And some local enterprising newspaper journalist, Bill Burkett, I think his name was, writes a story and comes up with the idea of flying saucers. The name stuck big time, but they weren't really shaped like saucers. They were shaped like almost like a rounded disc with a sort of a bat hatch shape towards the back kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of speculation that it was kind of secret military experimental aircraft, but it just didn't gel. And but the upshot of it was that there were literally hundreds of reports that followed in that early few weeks, and throwing into the mix the alleged crash of a UFO out at Roswell in New Mexico. And that was a sort of a big story for 24 hours.
So what are your...
Then kill stone dead.
So what are your thoughts on the Roswell incident? Tell me.
Oh, God, I wrote a column once for a magazine I used to write for, Ufologist magazine. Ufologist magazine was a Australian grounded publication, so it was good to write for it, and I had a regular column. I think I call it UFO History Keys, kind of using history as a way of anchoring the subject matter at various defined points. And one of the pieces I wrote was one of my favourite movies is Clint Eastwood's Good, Bad and the Ugly. I use that quote a lot because, the good, the bad and the ugly sort of applies to a lot of different subjects, particularly UFOs. There's so much of interest in it, but there's also a lot of rubbish as well.
There's a lot of rubbish, and you gotta like put a lot of effort in to steer clear of the rubbish, I think.
Yeah, well, I kind of with the UFO term that eventually became more popular, I kind of divided into two things: UFO reality and UFO theatre.
Yeah,
and we spend most of our time dealing with UFO theatre.
Yeah,
and that the real UFO reality is, phenomenon-wise, is something that's a lot rarer than the manifestations of the UFO theatre, and there's so much rubbish, but there's also a lot of interesting elements, popularisation of the subject, and clearly some of the most popular movies ever made are UFO related, Yeah. One of my personal favourites, The Day the Earth Stood Still.
The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yeah, it's a classic movie.
I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, you ought to check it out.
Yeah, is it good?
Oh yeah, it's retro, that's for sure. It's I think it came out in 1952 from memory. Michael Rennie, the old classic mantra of a UFO lands downtown in Washington, D.C. in broad daylight, scares the bejesus out of people in the park just near the White House, and objects sitting there, and then people, the tanks and everything surround it, and then a doorway appears and a walkway appears. Yeah, right. The classic shot. There's actually this is a let's show the camera, the exhibition book for the Penrith Gallery's sort of exhibition called The Visitors, and it's essentially subtitled The Australian Response to UFOs and Aliens. And the people running the show there, the gallery there, sort of said they wanted to put on a big exhibition about Australia's response to UFOs and aliens. And I thought, what are you going to do, just an exhibition room? He says, no, we're going to turn the entire gallery over to the UFO alien subject. And I thought, wow, it's a really nice place down by the river on the other side of Penrith.
Yep.
And it's so they got me involved as a consultant, paid consultant, even better. So I got involved with that, helped them set up an evidence room where I had a lot of my kind of archival stuff there under glass display and all that kind of stuff, and a filing cabinet where people could come into the X-Files room, so to speak, or the Oz-Files room, and sort of open up the filing cabinet, and there'd be all these kind of case studies spread out over the entire history of the UFO subject in Australia.
Did they have some legitimately weird case studies?
Oh, absolutely, because I was running that section, so I had some classic cases, and there was the actually I forgot to bring that. There was an early aviator, Francis Chichester, who was flying, trying to do the first solo flight from Lord Howe Island across to Sydney back in 1930, 31, I think, one of those 2 years. And aviation back in those days was a real adventure, you either made it or you didn't. And so he'd actually crashed. I think he crashed it, or he had to do major repairs to the plane at Lord Howe Island, and then decided to make the last run across the sea to Sydney. And he wrote a book about this back in 1931. That's right. So it must have been 1930, I think it took place. And he's flying across the sea, trying to get sort of navigation points. Everything was done by line of sight and everything. There's none of this worldwide navigation aids. You're literally on your own.
Yeah.
And there was the HMAS, the naval ship, the Knapp, that was ship sailing by. He could see that down lower down, and then went down lower, and they acknowledged his presence, and so they were keeping an eye on him. And so he was trying to make the final run through to Sydney, trying to get a navigational point, and he had to go around this big, huge storm front. And as he went around the side of it, out of clouds appeared what looked like a pearl-shaped object, quite a large thing, and he thought he was having a hallucination, like one of the difficulties of long-distance flying back in those days, that, fatigue and everything was a big issue, because you're there on your own, on a wing and a prayer. Basically.
And he was the only one in this plane at the time?
Yeah, solo flight. It's a solo flight.
Yeah.
In fact, the book I got, which is the first edition from 1931, he talks about it in later books that he wrote. He became world famous as a explorer. He would be a pilot, doing all sorts of record attempts while flying, like an older time version of Dick Smith, who used to try and fly around the world. He did it by helicopter and all that kind of stuff. But Francis Chichester was one of those kind of early seat-of-the-pants kind of explorers. So he also took on sailing as well and doing major sailing records, like travelling around the world and all that kind of stuff. And there seem to be a lot of those kind of people that are doing these record attempts. But on this particular day, he's there flying certainly several hundred miles away from the Australian coast. He hadn't seen the coast yet. So he's still trying to get a navigation fix, and he's coming around this storm front and sees this pearl-shaped thing come out, and he's looking at it, and he thought it was a hallucination, but then it got bigger, and then it seemed to disappear and then reappear, and then disappeared finally.
How have authorities tried to explain that?
Nobody tried to, because he kept it somewhat quiet, but he did talk about it in his book that he wrote called Solo Flight or something like that, that came out the next year. And he doesn't talk about flying saucers or UFOs because the terms hadn't even been invented as such, and so the UFO term in particular. And so he talks about it in one of his more famous books. What is it? The Lonely Sea or the Lonely Sky or something like that, which came out in about 1967. And by then, obviously, the term flying saucers and UFOs were quite well known. And so he was able to say that whatever I saw back then in 1930
he realised years later that that's what it was.
Yeah, because actually there were quite a few historical sightings, and that's one of the things I took a long interest in. I've always been interested in.
There's some big sightings in Australia.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm excited to talk to you about the Westall High.
Yeah.
Westall case.
Oh, yeah. Well, I want to know what you think about that. That's the famous one. I'll get into that. But the one of the things that particularly interested me was, everybody took the position, or a lot of people, a lot of critics took the position that UFOs or flying saucers were a short-term kind of fad that would die away. Well, whatever it was, it didn't die away. it just hung on and kept coming back in what appeared to be like waves.
There's a lot of people interested in it.
It's
absolutely. Got a lot of interest, this topic. So
yeah. Well, one of the things that interested me was there anything prior to 1947 that would be equate to what we interpret as the modern day UFO phenomenon? And there are literally hundreds of reports. Why 1947 turned out to be the big date, it's hard to recollect. Actually, something like about 5-6 months prior to Kenneth Arnold's sighting, that the publicity of it swept the world, down in Humble, South Australia, there were some significant sightings that took place that were, in fact, involved, I think, up to 5 objects being seen, seemingly coming out of the ocean down the Great Australian Bight and being observed at a couple of different locations. And they got a bit of publicity at the time, but it didn't break out into the international story that occurred months later with Kenneth Arnold in June 1947.
You know who David Grush is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, of course, yeah. He said...
Well, that's a more current...
That's very current. But he said that the first UFO that we ever got our hands on, was in the early 30s.
The magenta sightings.
Yeah, in Italy, yeah.
Yeah, well, again, I tend to be kind of driven by solid evidence, and where the evidence leads. And you have to understand the UFO scene in Italy. It's roughly divided by the more hardened, skeptical, show me the evidence type crowd, and the less perhaps critical but driven by the belief in UFOs and flying saucers. And this story of the magenta UFO crash, claims of a UFO, was didn't become a known story until I think the 80s or might have been the 90s. I can't remember, but it was a series of documents that seemed to appear, and there was a lot of claims about them being hoax documents and that kind of thing. And there was a lot of claims and counterclaims about it. So but certainly David Grush and others claim that the case was real. Now, what they're basing their information on, we're not privileged enough to know. But
so you think David Grush and some others have got information that they're like, they have obviously got information, but they've got like,
I don't know. I'm a bit sort of on the fence with it.
With Grush?
No, not necessarily with Grush. He seems a fairly compelling kind of guy when you look at David Grush's credentials.
He's got some pretty legitimate credentials.
Yeah, members of the media really did some shitty things, like revealing medical details. When one of your closest friends commits suicide, just after you talk to him on the phone, that's going to have a lot of heavy duty effects on you, kind of stuff. So no wonder he might have hit the bottle there at a few dark points in his life, like anybody would. You'd be doing it tough, particularly if it's a close friend that's offed himself, and you're the last person apparently that talked to him, kind of thing. You'd kind of start to blame yourself in many respects. But I think it became clear that he wasn't responsible. But a lot of guys that did.
So they were trying to make it as if David Grush was responsible for his mate's death.
No. They were just some journalists or a journalist. Who was, it seemed to me, rather unscrupulous, was given some information that led him to do a freedom of information inquiry with local police, and his wife, because of her concern about his welfare, had made a report that, because he had, like a lot of Americans, he had guns, and she was concerned that with the impact of his one of his best friends committing suicide, and here he is with some guns, and he was sort of really going downhill fast. That he needed some time to get himself sorted out, and he put himself into a rehab type facility to try and get himself straight and get through this, really difficult period. But unfortunately, the local sheriff deemed it okay to release some of these details. And really, private medical details should be private, really, because particularly when a lot of media and others and critics don't really go to the trouble of figuring out what it's all about. They just sort of take it as A equals B and that's it. You're damned by it. But really, he got over all that and started to get back into the military kind of situation again and served his country really well and was up there, one of the people that delivered some of the top secret stuff on a daily basis to the President of the United States kind of thing. So he was clearly incredibly well credentialed. And so what was quite striking was here's this guy with extraordinary credentials coming out with an extraordinary story, of a cover-up and, stories of
I
crash.
remember when it came out.
Yeah.
Oh, man, I was following it hard. I was excited. I was like, the moment's finally here.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It didn't really go anywhere, to be honest. Like, it came out with all this information similar to Bob Lazar.
Well, no, it's not. It's not really fair to say that it's gone nowhere because
I know, but I just felt like by now, because fast forward, that was like 2 years ago?
Yeah,
that he came out. I thought there would be more to come from it. I feel like it's kind of
my response to that is that I've been around for a long time in this subject, and there's ebbs and flows, and it's not the first time there's been a major breakout, even at government, congressional level, or at even in Australia. There's been ebbs and flows and periods over the decades, and so I'm pretty used to government entrenching. It's one end of government doesn't know what the other end of government is doing half the time, and so the likelihood of serious progress in this subject, one would be, particularly from my perspective, you're kind of surprised when there is momentum and there is major breakouts and progress, and so to me, since 2017, when Leslie Keane and reporters from the New York Times came out with the major breakout story in December 2017. That was a real turning point.
What was that? What was that story?
Well, it was the first time that a secret Pentagon UFO program was revealed.
Okay.
And this is a story connected to Luis Elizondo.
Yeah,
and that was really the big turning point.
Yeah.
And suddenly UFOs that for countless times over the period from 2017 back to 1947, the number of times that it's been said that UFOs are dead and yesterday's news, it's countless times. Every few years there'd be a major news report saying, UFOs, they're gone and buried, they're dead. It's all bullshit. There's nothing to it. But this 2017 reporting, even me as a hardened kind of regular to the subject, I was kind of astonished how big it took off. Literally right across the world, it just went ballistic. And I suppose with the internet, 24/7 media coverage worldwide, that's probably what made it a little different to earlier periods. But it was a huge story.
Yeah.
One of the top stories around the world for literally weeks and weeks. You couldn't turn on the TV without seeing a UFO story half the time,
So with someone like David Grush, do you hear his story and buy into it 100%?
No, I'm kind of cautious. I want to see the evidence in full clarity.
Have you met David Grush?
Huh?
Have you met David Grush?
No. My friend Ross Coulthart was the one that did the interview on News Nation. And
I've seen that.
Yeah, and did the big story for it, and kudos to him. He'd been in and around the UFO subject and taking an interest here in mainstream media in Australia with 60 Minutes, Channel 7 and other kind of things, and I was acting as a kind of a mentor to him to, push him along a bit and share a bit of stuff with him, and he certainly took the the lead kind of thing, and it's one of the more prominent kind of reporters on the subject. But what Ross brings to it, and he does cop a lot of flack, and inevitably you put your head above the the parapet kind of thing here with this subject, and every man and his dog thinks they're their own instant expert. But most of these instant experts know bugger all about the UFO subject. They're just kind of regular kind of. I use the word idiot.
These are people who are pessimistic or optimistic about this subject.
Oh, it runs both ways. Some of them are over the top, quite. But a lot of them are hypercritical. Anything that becomes a prominent story.
Bless you.
I'll have to take a break there.
That's all right.
Yeah, start again. Sorry, man. Hopefully you edit that out.
Nah, it's all raw.
It's all raw.
It's all raw, it ain't. There's no cuts.
Yeah, anyway, the with any big kind of story with this subject, there are so many kind of instant experts and debunkers and that kind of thing that will want to kill a story, that kind of thing. Excuse me.
All right.
It's like hay fever. Yeah, sorry.
No, you're all good.
But Ross, a pretty tenacious kind of guy, with the investigative reporting, and brings all the. Not only he had a background in the legal game, and then decided to go into full-time journalism, and that led to runs with 60 Minutes and Channel 7, a whole host of things, Sydney Morning Herald. So he was fairly well grounded, doing a lot of solid reporting, and even stationed in war zones and that kind of stuff. So he pretty interesting person to have to come on board to the UFO subject.
Is he in Australia still?
Oh, yeah, he's based in Australia, but he was originally from New Zealand.
He's from New Zealand.
Yeah, he grew up in New Zealand and then came to Australia, and then most of his journalistic career was in Australia. But amazingly, the commercial world here in media, they're very conservative, as it seems. They only are run by, it seems like with Channel 7, and most of what you get on Channel 7 these days on free-to-air TV is like variety shows or that kind of thing, or sport. That's it.
Yeah.
And Ross managed to convince them to do a special on UFOs, and it turned out to be the highest rating show that Channel 7 ever had.
Yeah, wow.
And you would think that with that, it wouldn't be so hard to get a second documentary out. You'd think they'd be chafing at the bit. Yeah. But it took a lot just to get a second documentary out of that.
Why do you think that is?
In transience, I don't know.
In transience?
Well, it's the history of the subject's got so much baggage associated with it.
Yeah. What's in transience mean?
A resistance to change, that kind of stuff. The get locked into a certain way of responding to something, like the usual response from media is it's all rubbish.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Don't pay attention. You're wasting your time.
You think Channel 7 is behind that? Like,
no.
Do you think after that first documentary, I'm saying like, there's a bit of light brought to this subject, and Channel 7 and other news stations might have been like, we don't really want the perception of this to change?
No, I don't think so. I think it's virtually all paid TV news broadcasts in Australia are under siege at the moment. Literally they're competing against online type outfits and stuff like that worldwide, and it's a very difficult road. A lot of people are arguing that free-to-air won't exist in Australia in a decade, and that we'll all have to get our news streamed from somewhere, probably not from Australia. You will be learning about the odd Australian story, but it'll be all international stuff, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And people get what they basically asked for. If you keep ignoring the need to have news about the world around you, you'll end up getting a very anemic-looking version of the news.
Yeah.
Already a lot of newspapers are getting their feed from localised kind of news agencies and that kind of stuff. But the death of long-form journalism seems to be evident. It's hard to get in-depth reporting on anything these days. It's all sound bites, and people just don't want news. They just want, well, if you can't get the story across in 30 seconds, don't tell me about it.
Yeah.
They don't want to know.
It's a problem.
Yeah, and yet
that's a big problem.
You wonder why people then sort of get all uptight when something overwhelms them, where if they were aware of the subject and spent a bit of time looking into it, they'd be better prepared for it. The same goes for UFOs. UFOs over the decades have been subject to all sorts of attacks, and it's like a wave function. Like there's a rise, then it falls away, disappears, then comes back again, and some of that sort of people argue that it's the media attention that causes UFO reports. Well, there's no evidence for that. Very little evidence. Most of the really solid UFO cases, they're the ones that drive the media attention, and then it starts to fall away. There's usually something solid there that precipitates media coverage that really gets it going.
Do you think Australian governments are hiding certain information?
Yeah. Well, the long and short of it is that's kind of a narrative that exists worldwide, that there are government programs.
Fiction or non-fiction narrative?
Well, I think there's a lot to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that with some authority is that I spent a lot of time trying to get access to Australian government files.
Yeah, so this brings me to something else, because I saw that you were one of the first civilians in the 80s, I believe, to gain access to the Royal Australian Air Force's classified UFO files.
Yeah, let me get a bit of a reality check here, borrow Ross's name for his show with News Nation. He's got now reality check. Yeah, the big plug, Ross. Yeah, you owe me one. So, yeah, the issue with the RAAF and Department of Defence here in Australia was that throughout the 70s they were saying anybody who's curious about the UFO subject, or they used a term which is no longer prevalent, UAS, unusual aerial sightings.
Right.
And at some point during the 60s, they started pumping out annual summaries. And so anybody, if you contact the Air Force or the Department of Defence, they'd send you off a standard letter and include a summary of the last year's reports. And this went on for quite a while, and it was a great way for the Department of Defence to answer responses. But there was this consistent figure of what they referred to as unexplained, unresolved cases. Around about 3 to 4% of all the sightings were difficult to explain. And they said that was due to not enough information, or it could have been due to it being a true UFO. Now, but civilian researchers tried to get access to a lot of those files, particularly during the 60s, and there was very limited success. I think Paul Norman and Judy McGee from the Victorian group, when the military headquarters were based in Victoria, got a little bit of limited access to the files. But I started to look into it more deeply, and I had a science background, went through university and that kind of stuff, and got a honours science degree, majoring in chemistry and pure mathematics kind of thing. It was but all that did was gave you, I guess, the skills of diving deep and always knowing to really go hard and figure out what's behind a story. Don't just go for the surface detail, because really the reality might be far different to what the surface detail is. And so eventually I started a bit of a long campaign mainly initially through letter writing to get access to the government files on UFOs. And basically what was the end result? Bugger all, nothing. They'd send you a few little reports, usually redacted, meaning that parts were censored.
So when you got access to these files, it's not like you actually went somewhere to see them?
I did eventually.
Oh, okay.
I did eventually.
All right.
I thought, they kept saying that anybody could get access to the file, but the reality was you couldn't.
Yeah.
And in the end, I started, and what turned it over for me personally at the time was that in 1981, I got appendicitis.
Yeah.
And I ended up having 2 weeks in hospital, and that was right between I was transitioning from one quality assurance management job into another company.
Yeah.
And the guy I was replacing was going off to be the international quality assurance manager based in Chicago, and I was taking his job over in just north of Hornsby at a factory site there. And we went off together and had a bit of a mad dinner, booze up, whatever, and we both came down with food poisoning.
Yeah.
He managed to recover enough to get on the flight and go to the States. He must have been in pretty bad shape. But me, I just got worse and worse, and then ended up appendicitis.
Yeah.
And it was in that period of 2 weeks recovery. I even got peritonitis. Very dangerous thing, appendicitis. But I decided, here I am stuck in bed, can't go anywhere, still trying to recover. What the hell? I'll start a phone campaign talking to the Department of Defence and keep going and not accepting no. And I just kept going on and on and on. And over a couple of months, I eventually got what I wanted, and that was that they agreed to allow me to have access at the Department of Defence headquarters in Canberra and examine the files there on the spot.
Damn.
All
right.
They kind of probably expected me to turn up on the day, look at a few files, etc., and go home happy. Well, I arrived on the Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and I finished my exercise on Friday at 5 o'clock.
You went through
5 days. No, but
shit, 5 days of it.
5 full days going through files.
Fucking hell.
But that told me that I was looking at about one of the key things I was looking for were indicators of file numbers. And so I wanted to identify what the whole paper trail was within the Department of Defence, not only with Air Force, but the Navy, Army, and also within military intelligence, who were the main players, trying to identify all this. That's what I call diving deep, the deep dive.
But if there was something in those files that, someone didn't want you to see, they would have
of course
taken them out.
Of course. The absurdity of it, really, on the first day, I'm waiting for the files to turn up, and in comes the poor secretary and clerical people. They're dragging three big postal sacks full of files. And I thought, this is a pretty unusual way to deliver files. So anyway, I pulled them all out, laid them all out in order, started quickly going through them. And then after about 45 minutes, they came rushing back and saying, "Oh, Bill, sorry, our apologies. Unfortunately, these files haven't been declassified yet. You're not supposed to be looking at classified files." So some poor bastard had to sit down for an hour or so doing the rubber stamp, literally going on every single page on every file, unclassified, and signing it and dating it.
Right.
That was part of the system.
Would that not be the process of picking which ones you can and can't see, but?
Not really by that stage, no.
No?
They obviously made the assumption that it had been cleared to look at the files,
right,
but the files themselves had to be declassified.
Okay, so what is some of the most interesting things that you found in these files?
Look, what I found was essentially the Air Force was grappling with the same sort of problem that civilian researchers have been grappling with for decades. The only thing different was that they had access to perhaps better facilities if they ever got to the point where they were seriously interested in the subject. Most of the time they tried to deflect it. They weren't interested. But even when their own personnel were witnessing UFO phenomena, they tended to downplay it.
Yeah.
That's at the upper echelons, and yet
when their own personnel.
Yeah,
So,
pilots.
Yeah, pilots and
Air Force pilots, naval pilots.
Yep.
One of the classic UFO cases that one of the I often refer to as one of my favourite cases was back in 1954. Oh, okay. In 1954, there was a worldwide UFO flying saucer wave, and in Australia it was no exception. But we had a breakout of sightings in Victoria in January, and then it sort of went quiet, and then it took off again in May, June. But one of the biggest sightings was a case of during late August 1954, there was a naval Sea Fury pilot by the name of James O'Farrell. He had the nickname Seamus. That's how I got to know him. And I got to meet him directly, personally. And he, in fact, was there for the book launch of my book, The Oz Files, at the State Library in New South Wales. And that was a dark and stormy night, that book launch. It was one of the worst nights of weather in Sydney for a decade. You don't plan these things, but that's the way it was. But so we were all stuck inside, huddled, bunkered down deep within the State Library while there was a major storm. And it took me hours and hours to get home. The storm was really bad. But anyway, cut a long story short, Seamus O'Farrell was flying a naval Sea Fury plane doing a cross-country run, and he was over the Goulburn area of New South Wales or near it, and he sees two objects, bright lights, come and take a position either side of his aircraft. And he's thinking, what the hell is this, And he's thinking, if I report this to Naval Ground Station at Nowra, my flying career will go down the gurgle. So he's thinking, I don't think I'll report this. I'll just keep flying and hope they don't do anything. And then on the radio come, the awaited regular navigation check. And then at the end of that, the Nowra Naval Air Station saying, oh, yeah, by the way, we got two aircraft that seem to be tracking you either side. Can you tell us what's going on? Basically, ad-libbing there a bit. And he told me that he said, I could have kissed those guys because they took the heat off me. I didn't have to report the UFO. They were asking me. And they said that we're tracking it on radar. And so you had radar correlation, of what was happening to him.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said that one of the objects crossed in front of him. At one point, these objects came in so close to him that he thought in his head, we're going to have a mid-air collision. And as soon as he thought that, they moved out again. And he thought, what the hell's going on there? And he thought for a moment, are they reading my mind or what? But then one of the objects passed in front of him and the two of them then take off and it made him, he said, it made me look as though I'm flying one of the fastest planes in Australian skies, and it made me look as though I was standing still.
And how many different people, so he was obviously the only one in the plane.
And you
got two people on the ground.
Yeah, it had Nowra and the people in the radar room that were tracking it on radar.
Okay.
And there were two separate witnesses. Narralluan, I think it was. There was a ground trig marker where I think a PMG technician saw it go over.
Yeah.
And also, in terms of its track towards Sydney, guys in air traffic control at Sydney Airport also witnessed it. So that was a major, major sighting.
Yeah.
And it caused the Australian military intelligence machine, and that included the newly formed Joint Intelligence Organisation that was to coordinate intelligence right across all the military departments, to wake up and take notice. Whoa, and everybody said that he was a reliable witness and all that kind of stuff, So
do you think like highly regarded military officials, pilots, whatnot, are scared to report these types of sightings? Because
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's even worse now. Here we have, since 2017, we've had a huge uptick in media interest. No longer it's becoming rare for the really debunking media, although it's starting to come back a bit now. The usual shock writers and all that, they feel as though they're safe to come out with a debunking report. The latest version of it is the Wall Street Journal's come out with a real debunking piece, in the last week, a two-parter. And it's a joke. It really, they just haven't done their homework. And that seems to be the history of it. But overall, there's been a major uptick in terms of more serious journalism, more serious writing, and a much broader interest from scientist types and university types and all that kind of stuff. So it's had a huge impact on changing it. But that interest has increased quite a lot, and plus also there's a huge amount of congressional interest in the United States.
Yeah.
They've done all these studies and all that kind of stuff, and they're trying to they think that there's going to be a big disclosure type thing.
I've been hearing that for a while.
Yeah, well,
that's what I was kind of leaning at, kind of hinting at before, because I don't know, I feel like I've been told disclosure's coming for a while.
Well, you might feel frustrated, but think about poor old me. I've been involved in the field since actively, really full time, kicking off doing serious research and investigations around about the early 1970s. And I've been at it ever since. But for me, I'm more interested in what's happening around me. I'm not that interested in what the Congress will do or what this American government will do. Yeah. I'm a bit more interested in what our own Air Force is doing.
All right, so
and right now, it's very easy to summarise where the Air Force is at. Yeah. They're allegedly doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah,
and they say that any report by our own people can be handled in the normal air incident investigations. And it's clear that it's not.
Yeah.
That there seems to be within the Department of Defence, there's still this heavy-duty kind of if you wanted to seriously look at something, and you would think right now, in 2025, we live in very contested military times, there is a lot of concern about World War III is going to kick off pretty soon. That's a lot of concern. There's a lot of conflicts going on.
Iran.
Yeah, but even
Iran and Israel kicked off.
Yeah.
Yes, a couple of days ago.
And here we've got our own government worrying about the Chinese Navy circumnavigating Australia with their, new destroyers and doing live fire exercises between Australia and New Zealand. And this is the Chinese government. And you would think, given that proximity of potential adversaries, and we hope that never occurs, you would think that any unusual, unexplained object in the sky would be the focus of huge amounts of attention.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Yeah.
Now, their own pilots feel awkward and constrained in reporting sightings to up the deck. They still feel that they might lose, the ability to climb up through the ranks just because they've reported sightings. But no, I've gone to the trouble of diving down really deep, and there's a book here, UFOs in Government, edited mainly by Michael Swords and Robert Powell. I really recommend people try and grab that book. It's a massive book, but I wrote the chapter on Australia in it, and it's really like a very detailed assessment of the history of military intelligence involvement in Australia and the UFO subject, right from the word go.
Yeah.
They had one of the early chiefs who became chief of air staff. He, as a young pilot back in 1931, was sent to investigate what appeared to be strange lights and things happening around near Warrnambool in Victoria. That's in 1931. They weren't sure what it was, but, he tried to investigate. But at that stage, our Air Force wasn't that significant back then.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really even an air force as such. It was just closest military pilot around and send him off to investigate UFOs or something that appeared to be UFOs back in 1931.
So with where you're at in your life, do you feel like you know within yourself that we are 100% not alone?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And you 100% believe with every part of your body?
No. I don't call it belief. It's not belief.
You know.
It's by sheer experience.
Mm-hmm.
Talking to hundreds of people around Australia, qualified people, military people, members of the general public, all that kind of thing. People that bring enormous credentials sometimes to their own sightings and that kind of stuff, and my own sightings as well. I was kind of
you've had your own sightings.
Yeah. Well, I guess the
what have you seen? Tell me what you've seen.
Well, I had one event back in 1969 that because I was diving deep into the subject by then, but not really investigating the subject quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm out on the middle of the Clarence River on a surfboard, middle of the afternoon, on a mate's surfboard, doing what you do on a Saturday afternoon, and I'm looking across to the river's edge, and I see all this white material coming down. And I immediately thought, oh, right, this could be spider's web stuff coming down, because there were some famous cases, particularly in France back in the early 50s at Oulon and Gillac, two locations in France that involved structured objects and all sorts of material that would come down. When this white material came to the ground, people would handle it and it would disappear in their hands. And
what?
Yeah, and I thought, well, yeah, that's interesting. But a lot of people speculated it must have been, now for those people that are phobic about spiders, you probably want to stop listening at the moment. But really, if you realised how much traffic there was up there from little baby spiders that are doing what's called balloon webs, ballooning across the skies, like huge arrays of web with little baby spiders attached to them, they're flying.
Really?
That's why they call it ballooning.
I've never heard of this.
They sit on a high point, spin the web, the wind catches it, and up they go.
Yeah, wow.
It's their way of travelling.
No way.
There's stuff comes down everywhere. But
and that's what you thought that
that's what I thought it was.
Yeah, okay.
And I thought, oh, yeah, great. I'm going over there to have a look at it. So I paddled my way over to it, get out of the water, walk up, and there's stuff everywhere. And I'm picking it up, and I'm looking at it, and I roll it up into a ball. I can't see any little – the first thing I expected to see were hundreds of little spiderlings. That's what they call little baby spiders.
Yeah.
And there's none there. I thought, they must have decamped pretty quickly, but that was unusual. They usually are very slow, and they just start spreading out. And I'm looking at this stuff, and I roll it up in the ball, and then it disappears on me, and it went from what appeared to be like a solid to a gas. And
from a solid to a gas.
Yeah. A few years later, I'm at university training to become a chemist, industrial chemist. And I learned more about a term called sublimation. It means it changes and misses a standard phase, like solid. The usual transition is from solid to liquid to gas. You go through all those three steps. But what appeared to be happening here, I'm looking at a solid, it disappears, and it appears to be gas. Now, somewhat foolishly perhaps, in retrospect, I put my hand up to my nose. No serious after effects unless you call UFO obsession a serious problem. But anyway, but I'm looking around, I'm thinking, what the fuck is this stuff? It's not spider's web. And I'm racing across to my mate's place who had borrowed the surfboard off, and I run into the kitchen and scream out to his mother, give me some glass jars, will you? Screw top lids, please. Empty. Yeah. And I'm running out with it, and she's used to me. She was used to me at that point coming in with all strange requests. And I run back to the river's edge. There's nothing there to be seen. The spider web type material is gone. I dive into the water, paddle the surfboard about half a mile down the river in the direction of the wind, and nothing in evidence. I get back home, Mum and Dad are talking about seeing something strange go overhead. I'm thinking, what? I hadn't looked up at any point. I'm looking at this stuff on the river's edge. And so that was the first thing I thought, wow, did I actually come close to examining what they referred to as angel's hair, this material that was linked to UFOs? I thought maybe not. But it was decades later that another case occurred up in far north New South Wales, near Tenterfield, I think, from memory. And it was, but this time it was so close to like a rerun of the early French reports in the 1950s. Dumbbell-shaped object, sparks seemed to be coming from it, going to little discs, and they were moving backwards and forwards, and down would come this debris and all that kind of stuff. And it was a really interesting report. But that 1969 event was probably the first thing that was close to real UFOs for me. And
why would something that's travelled, like millions and millions of light years or whatever across the galaxy, travel that far in an object, in a craft that leaves traces of itself or leaves debris as it's flying through our atmosphere?
What do you think we do with our own cars as we travel around the countryside?
Yeah, I get that.
We leave tyre track marks, rubber marks, we leave exhaust fumes, we leave all sorts of things.
Yeah.
We can track our own height of technology for humankind to get around.
Yeah.
Even aircraft do it, leave behind traces of, and so
do our aircraft leave like physical traces though that we can like pick up?
I won't get into the contrail, chemtrail type debate. That's another subject in its own matter. But and a lot of it's full of paranoia and conspiracy theory and all that kind of stuff. But aircraft at a certain altitude, you'll see the contrails, and that's the exhaust coming out, and you can see that. And if you were there sitting on the back of the aircraft taking samples, which you wouldn't be, but you could get a measure, an interpretation, maybe, of what makes this thing, the aircraft, tick, if you were an outsider. Same goes for UFOs. If you look at a case like potentially angel's hair, that it might well represent a pathway into what might be going on inside it, that kind of stuff. So it was, for me, I'm getting more and more into the world of physical science, thinking, let's look at this. This might be a way of figuring out what's going on with UFOs. It was you needed to collect data. Most people are making their own minds up about UFOs and flying saucers, and now UAPs. Like UAP, what a term! Are we going to call this field? We call it ufology now. We're going to call it upology, an apology to the unidentified. It's kind of, I kind of hope that UAPs move on, but UAPs are now being picked up big time by academia, military intelligence, that kind of stuff. So I'm comfortable using that term, but even a mate of mine, this guy here, one of the better researchers, if you want a good summary of what's going on about UFOs, get this book by Robert Powell, UFOs.
Yeah.
Science explains what we know and don't know about UFOs.
Right.
It's a great book. He gets into the argument about, terminology. It was flying saucers or Foo Fighters, or then it becomes, from flying saucers it becomes UFOs, and from UFOs it becomes UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomena. It's kind of gone full circle. The term UAP was used by the military back in the 50s briefly, and by various players in more recent decades to try and get away from the stigma of UFOs and flying saucers.
Yeah.
Make it more mainstream, more like, we don't want to study UFOs, but we will study UAPs. Well, why? Because UAPs don't have that connotation with all the baggage that hitchhikes along with UFOs. But give it time. It's already got that baggage. UAPs, a strong baggage with wrestling cries about crashed UFOs and stuff like that. It's all crashed UAP now, aliens, whatever, or time travelers, or goodness knows what else. There's all sorts of possibilities involved. But I was more interested in going beyond listening to individual people telling me about what's going on. I wanted to see the phenomenon myself and do the classic mainstay of scientific experimentation. That is the repeatable experiment. And the best way to do that is to go hunting UFOs. And if you can find out about a locality where there's like a breakout of sightings, particularly if it's isolated and it's away from built-up areas, they're the best kind of areas. And I was kind of very lucky during my university career to have one of those highly localised, isolated breakout areas at a place halfway between Grafton and Armidale. And Armidale is where I was going to University of New England, of a breakout location called, it's a little village. Well, that's a big call calling it a village. There's only about one house there. It's a service station, cafe kind of thing that services local properties and drive-through type people. So this little area called Tyringham, for some reason, started to repeatedly have UFO sightings by the locals and people passing through. And a local electronics technician, Warwick Ford, he told me about this, and he was servicing local farmers and people living in an area that he was hearing and seeing UFO sightings. And he lived up the back of that, behind the ridgeline of the cafe, up on a property called Mollydale. And so I was going up there. I was literally going up there every weekend for a period of about a month or two. And almost as soon as I arrived, I'm seeing UFOs. And we started to bring in equipment. Like, here we've got a...
You were seeing them the second you pulled up? You were seeing
No, not quite that. It was generally speaking mainly during the night. But
like straight away, I mean, not like the second.
Well, what I was doing straight away was initially trying to get my handle on, I'm trying to be a human vacuum cleaner, sucking up all sorts of information, trying to figure out what are these people seeing? Is it explainable or is it unexplainable? And it turned out that while there were events that were mistakes and misinterpretations, there were an awful lot of things that seemed to be going on. Like, you think about it, like we would be able to create this now with drone technology and whatever perhaps, but here we had, back in 1973, people at the cafe looking out over what was locally called Boney Mountain. And this is where they used to congregate, and play games, and objects were seen, dish-shaped things.
Boney Mountain.
Yeah.
I think that's what
I think it's actually called Mount Highland.
I'm not too sure. There's a mountain in Australia that I was actually wanting to ask if you knew anything about that's apparently got big UFO sightings.
Oh, you're probably thinking of what's the place?
I think it's up near Northern Territory.
Pine Gap. That's Mount... God, I talk about it in my book. Momentary blank out, but I do it in a footnote here. The name comes at Mount Zeal.
Yeah,
Mount Zeal.
Yeah.
It comes up in my book here of the Alien. I'm talking about remote viewing, and it was the remote viewers.
Okay, all right.
That come up with the I think 3 or 4 locations around the world, and one of them was Mount Zeal, and the research guy, I think it was Hal Potoff, Dr. Hal Potoff at the...
I know him.
Yeah.
I know of him.
Yeah.
He was on Joe Rogan not long ago.
Yep. Well, he's been in and out of this game for quite a long time, but
with remote viewing, right?
Yeah, he was asked, as it turned out, the Stanford Research Institute was basically a cover. It was the CIA that were paying for the research. They wanted they heard that the Soviets were doing this kind of thing, and they thought, well, we don't want the Soviets to get ahead of us. Let's check out what this is all about. And so they got Stanford Research Institute scientists, particularly Dr. Hal Potoff and Dr. Russell Targ, to do some basic experiments in psychic research. And initially they were studying people like Uri Geller and a whole bunch of different players. But then they got into remote viewing and initially seemed very, very hokey to begin with, but then they started to get some verifiable results. And they thought, what the hell? And this is how the Mount Seal angle comes up. One of the better remote viewers said, I've been doing some remote viewing and there's several facilities around the world and one at Northern Territory near one of in Central Australia at Mount Seal. Anyway, Hal Potoff, through various connections, because he was obviously the contact point for this research for the CIA, knew or through various people who the current CIA station chief at Pine Gap was. Contact him and ring him up and said, anything unusual happening around Pine Gap? No, nothing ever happens here, mate. And he said, oh, yeah, the only things that have been happening are all the UFO sightings around Mount Seal, which is about, what was it? I went out there at one point, trying to remember. It was hard to keep track of the mileage because you're on pretty rough roads going out to Mount Seal.
Yeah.
And but it's not that far. It's like an hour or something like that, hour or two. I can't remember quite how far it was now. There's nothing to see there. There's no opening portals or anything like that. It's just a mountain, a rough-looking mountain kind of stuff. Nice-looking spot. You can climb over it and all that kind of stuff, but maybe there's something down there, maybe there's not, but you can't see anything from outside. But according to the Goss, there's maybe something going on there, but who knows?
Have you ever been there?
I just said, yeah, I have been there.
You've been there?
Yeah, I've driven out there.
Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
I thought you were telling me a story of someone else that had been there.
Yeah. No, I'd gone to Alice Springs to look into UFO sightings and some stories of possible UFO crashes out the back of Alice Springs. And obviously we did the routine of getting up on the ridge and looking at Pine Gap and all that usual routine. But we were mainly interested in all the UFO stories coming out of it. And one of them at that time was Mount Seal. So off we went to Mount Seal and we're thinking, well, there's nothing to see here. Like we're not on a need-to-know basis here. We don't know what we're looking for. If there is something here, it's very hidden. But who knows? Yeah. So there's a rich bunch of anecdotal stories about what happened or what is going on at Mount Seal, but nobody's been able to verify it outside in the public realm anyway.
Right.
So it's an interesting place.
So
a lot of Aborigines see UFOs in that area. It's rich.
In like ancient Aboriginal art, like hieroglyphs and whatnot, there's a lot of UFO depictions.
Absolutely. There's a lot of Aboriginal art communities off to the west of Alice Springs, and are very close to Pine Gap and other places. And some of the current artists, they put into their paintings aliens and UFOs and crashed UFOs as well.
Wow.
And I'm asking, what's this all about? And they say, well, we have a lot of UFO sightings around here, but the standard interpretation is that it's them talking through art about alienation. White people, Aborigines feel that they're alienated by white people, and it's only the miners coming in to rip up the countryside to dig. It's kind of like a alien abduction. In fact, the legendary Aboriginal singer Archie Roach wrote a song called Alien Abduction. Great lyrics, really marvellous singer, but he passed away recently. And but it was really a metaphor for the fact that his own people are being abducted. He himself turned out to be a stolen generation child. In fact, from the Bundjalung people up on the Clarence near Grafton.
Yeah.
And it was one of the locals, a woman, Lorraine Maffey Williams, who was a tribal person. She'd been given, according to her narrative, tribal spiritual lore, like a person of high degree. Within Aboriginal culture, there's the tradition of shamanism, where tribal people of special talents are chosen, or whatever chooses you to become the shaman or the witch doctor of the tribe, kind of thing, or the recipient of all the tribal knowledge, pass on to the tribal people, particularly the men that have knowledge and power. They get initiated, and one of the parts of that, of the Aboriginal law, is this: what happens to those shaman type people, those people of special gifts, who could be male and female, but mainly male. The initiation ceremony of back in the day of Aboriginal tribal people to become a shaman, or in Australian anthropological terms, men of high degree. They call it Aboriginal men of high degree. They would be abducted by strange entities that would take them up into the sky house.
Right.
And one of the locations that I looked into and investigated a lot was just outside of Bourke. We're out there actually investigating yet another story of crashed UFOs just out the back of Bourke. And there was a location as you drive into Bourke, you look off to the right, and you see what looks like a mini version of Uluru or Ayers Rock, and it's called Mount Oxley, and it's Aboriginal land, but you can get the key to access the gates to get out there, but no Aboriginal will come with you at night time.
Really?
We wanted to camp on Mount Oxley, and I knew that the law, the story. When I say law, I mean LORE, law.
Yeah.
And part of that law was that their Aboriginal name for Mount Oxley was Wooby Wooby, and it was the where the tribal men of high degree, the Wirrans, as they call them locally, would go there and commune with the sky gods, and they would go up into Bayami's home and meet the gods in their house.
And whereabouts is this located? Mount Oxley?
Mount Oxley. Don't stampede Mount Oxley, please. It's Mount Oxley, when you go to it, it's a lovely area. Well, you got to get used to. Bourke for me is the beginning of the outback. Once you leave Bourke and keep going west, you start to really encounter the outback.
Yeah.
It gets really incredibly dry, and a lot of desert country and stuff like that. Dry, really dry. So if you're not up for it, don't go. You're going to run into trouble. You have to plan for it. But Mount Oxley, staying overnight at Mount Oxley was really interesting.
But whereabouts is Mount Oxley?
As I said, as you're driving into Bourke from the eastern side, if you look to your right, you'll see this little mini version of what looks like Uluru.
Yeah.
And you look at it and thinking, oh, that looks like Ayers Rock, Uluru, and you've got to check it out. And when we found out about it, it was it had a hell of a story to it.
Wow.
So that's why we thought, yeah, we're going to get the keys and we're going to go out. And as it turned out, after we returned, we'd camp. We saw some light phenomena, but it was pretty low weight type stuff, and but it was just really interesting. The first Caucasian white person explorer, I think it was it Oxley? I think that, yeah, it might have been Oxley, coming across the plain, the ground on horseback, and approaching what would become modern day Bourke. But back in those days, there was nothing there other than Aboriginals and rough settlements here and there. Is approaching this what looked would become Mount Oxley, and he hears what sounds like huge explosions coming across the landscape at him. Boom, no, real like gunfire, massive cannon fire.
Yeah.
And he's thinking, what the hell is that? And he finally gets to it. Actually, it wasn't Oxley. But anyway, it slips my mind. But the explorer, they climb what becomes known as Mount Oxley. And on the top, one of the key features that he kind of linked to these noise that he was hearing as he approached it from the distance was a huge crater of broken up rock. And it's still there today. I've got photographs of me standing there on top of it, in the middle of it, and it's all this broken up, broken shards. Now, was there something going on there that was breaking up all these rocks, and then somehow it became a kind of a crater? Now, a few months after we'd gone there, I get a contact inquiry from a Scandinavian researcher who was spending time with a lot of the local Aborigines, and he wanted us to help him to try and explain a photographic anomaly that he had taken when he was standing there, one of the tribal local people on Mount Oxley, and they're taking photographs, and they're near this crater. And there's like this, you look at the photograph and it looks like a doorway, a portal, and that's the feeling they got, that this was a gateway. Now, I'm looking at it and thinking, that no, it could be like a water droplet inside the camera lens and forming, but it wasn't there before or after, and so you're never sure, but it sure looks interesting. And the fact that it correlated with this anthropologist being there with the tribal elder, and they both sensing that this area, it's like an opening, and then they take a photograph and it looks in the photograph like an opening, a portal type of effect.
Yeah, wow.
But we didn't see that there. We didn't have anything as interesting as that.
Not that lucky, eh?
Nah. But, Mount Oxley's an interesting place, but treat it with due reverence and consideration. Don't use it as like a lot of unfortunate Westerners do. They tend to rubbish areas.
Yeah.
I remember going down to Victoria once, and I was wanting to see, I'm interested in art, not only science and all that kind of stuff, and I'm always interested in Aboriginal stuff. And I knew there was a cave called Bunjalung Cave or Bunjil Cave. It was Biami or Bunjil, the equivalent Sky Guide in Victoria. And this place, it was like a cave, a big rock formation, and a little cave. And it was 20 or 30 miles through really rough terrain to get to it. And you're thinking, we're going to be able to get up close to this. We had all this directions to get to it. We finally got to it, and the bloody thing's all fenced off with bars in front of it, only to stop bloody graffiti artists.
Wow.
Graffiti all over the rock. Now, it's awful. But the painting itself, the wall painting is still intact, but you got to photograph it through the bars.
Yeah.
And I just thought, that says a lot. Like, why would locals or others go all that way to a remote location that has major significance to local Aborigines and graffiti all over it? I was here, So Sharon loves somebody, that kind of, all this graffiti over the thing. People have, I don't know, really bizarre kind of expectations, or they just don't respect the environment.
So I want to know about the Westall case. What do you know about the Westall case?
Oh, God.
Westall High School in the 60s, was it?
Yep, 66.
66.
April 66.
Yeah.
Now, it was what I regarded as a sleeper case.
A sleeper case.
A sleeper case is the kind of thing where you hear a little bit about it, and then it basically goes very quiet. You learn little fragments about it, and you're hoping to learn a lot more, and then it breaks open decades later.
Yep. Okay.
And that's what's happened with Westall.
Why did it break open again
I
decades later?
think it was the fact that we finally get the World Wide Web. It's much easier to track people down.
Yeah.
Like I wrote about Westall. I devoted 6 pages to it in my book, The Oz Files. It came out in 1996. And The Oz Files is subtitled The Australian UFO Story. So it's essentially a kind of a general history of the subject in Australia. If you want to get it, go for it. But it's not in print at the moment.
Yeah.
So secondhand, or I'm trying to work on an updated version of it.
Yeah.
But so in that, I devote 6 pages to Westhall, and it was reported at the time briefly in the local paper and a few little short pieces in the main paper, and then nothing. It goes cold. And the story that came into the local paper, the Dandenong Journal, talks about the local children seeing it. There was a Channel 9 report. I remember of all places going to Mount Gambier in Western Australia back in 1976 for the total eclipse of the sun, the best place for totality. Japanese scientists had invested thousands of dollars to figure out what area would be cloud-free in Australia to track the total eclipse. And it turned out to be this farming property about 20 miles out of Mount Gambier. And here's us people. There was a UFO conference at Mount Gambier that same weekend. Now, journalists would take the shortcut and say, "Oh yeah, UFO researchers obsessed with have a UFO conference," and they argue that we're linking solar eclipses to UFOs. You know, that was rubbish. It wouldn't surprise most people that if you're interested in the night sky and investigating UFOs, you either are or already very interested in the night sky and you have a very detailed knowledge of astronomy. And so the chances of witnessing a total eclipse in totality was, everybody knows about eclipse events where there are people literally following eclipses around the world all the time, trying to be there for a totality. It's an awesome event, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
So I went across with a mad cross-country jaunt with a mate of mine, Dr. Jeff Stevens, who was a metallurgist with the Atomic Energy Commission at Lucas Heights. So we decided to share the driving and drive cross-country through to Mount Gambier. So we got there in time, and we're all set up there with our gear and our different special goggles to look at it. And we were interested in capturing what's called Bailey beads, where you get the perimeter of the corona, and you can see this like a beaded effect going right around it's really the cliffs and things like that of the moon that are causing bits of light to break through, and that's what they refer to as Bailey's beads. It's a great effect, but you're getting an intensity of light coming through, and you've got to have the right gear. And we're telling people all the time, there are hundreds of people up there by the time we got up there, plus all the UFO conference people, and Channel 9 was there. And that's the reason why I'm mentioning Channel 9 in relationship to Westhall. I'll get back to Westhall. Yeah, we have the totality. I've got Channel 9 sort of trying to interview me it was on the pinnacle. There's this big giant outcrop, and everybody's all on top of there with all their gear, and they're interviewing me, and the reporter's saying, "Can you just step back a bit further?" And I got to a point saying, "Look, I'm not going back any further. See this? Look down. Yeah, there's a 200-foot drop there. I'm not going any further." So they just wanted this beautiful shot. And anyway, they did their story, and the eclipse happened. It was extraordinary to see it. The only place in the local landscape where there was cloud was that farm where the Japanese scientists spent years trying to predict where there'd be no clouds. That's where the clouds were.
Right.
We had a clear shot. We could see the eclipse, the actual shadow rolling across the landscape, right across to us. Extraordinary sight. And then everything went quiet. The birds, the flowers close up as if it's dark. And it was total darkness, really dark. In the middle of the day. I think it was 4 o'clock seems to stick in my mind. I don't think so. It might have been about that time. I can't remember. But marvellous phenomenon. If you get a chance to see a real total eclipse, go for it. It really is awesome.
Yeah, wow.
To say the least. But I get back to Sydney, and about a month later, there's this report on Channel 9, and it's a UFO report, and it had the story of us on Mount Gambier for the conference, but it also had a little black and white clip showing a school student talking about a UFO sighting, and she had a drawing. And I immediately, it wasn't identified, but I said, that's got to be Marilyn Eastwood, the one student that was named in the Dandenong Journal report from 1966. And plus there was the school teacher, Andrew Greenwood, both describing it in detail. It was a pretty impressive report of the Dandenong Journal for its time. But that's the only time I'd seen this footage, because people have spent years looking for this apocryphal piece of Channel 9 footage, and whatever happened to it after 1966. The folklore is that Kerry Packer, I think, or his father wanted the footage sent to him, and that's the story that it ended up in his archives or something.
Right.
But then I see this report in 1976 covering the UFO conference at Mount Gambier, and there's this black and white clip. It only goes for a few seconds, showing the schoolgirl and the drawing. And it's clear to me, and Marilyn Eastwood, who's now under a different name, married, she confirms that that's her, and that's her drawing. And so we'd love to get hold of that piece of footage, even that little bit of footage. But Channel 9, you can't penetrate their archives or their bureaucracy. They don't claim to have it. So that's the case with a lot of commercial TV stations. Their archives are very limited. Even the ABC, who's committed to archiving, their archives are thin and far between. So it's a bit of a mixed search. Maybe we'll be able to find it, but it's not going to show too much. It'll just show interviews with a number of the kids there.
So there were heaps of students from that day.
Oh, absolutely.
That said that they saw something.
Something happened, and the standard skeptical explanation is that it was part of the highball balloon program. That a highball balloon, this is a balloon that's inflated, and they were usually being launched at Mildura. The reports generally argue that it was a secret balloon program. Well, it wasn't secret. It was being reported in the media of the day. What was secret was what they were using it for, and that was to pick up on evidence in the atmosphere of possible atmospheric nuclear tests at that time by the Russians, but also later on by the Chinese. And so they saw aerial capture of air samples as a way of picking up on possible evidence of radiation in the atmosphere. Yeah. But of course, we had the helpful British doing their Maralinga bomb drops or bomb explosions at Maralinga and Montebello off the coast of Western Australia to contribute to a large amount of radiation in our atmosphere. Practically everybody in Australia was exposed during the Maralinga bomb test to some level of radiation. So if you're born, I hate to tell you guys, if you're as old as I am, that you've probably been exposed to a little bit of radiation. But a courtesy of the British bomb tests. But so that, I think that's part of the reason why Australia rightly became very active on campaigning against atmospheric tests and even underground tests. A real problem. Just it makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah, let's let off a bomb in the atmosphere. Let's let off a bomb underground. What harm can it possibly do? Yeah, you got to be joking.
There was I saw something like yesterday actually. I was reading about the Westall case again, and it said that there was a student who saw this craft land in the field.
Yeah.
Her friend or his friend, I don't know exactly, runs up to the UFO.
Yeah. And she can't be found.
Can't be found.
No,
yeah.
Ross looks into that a bit. I tried to look in it way back in the 90s, but we just didn't have enough information to do it then. But he was able to dig a bit further, and she's been found. Oh. And she wasn't rushed off to some asylum or anything like that. Her parents or the family were changing address and moving to another location.
Well,
and they just didn't tell the school.
so in what I was reading, it said that that her friends pulled up at her house after the event, knocked on the door. Someone
that's an odd part of the story, but
claim that no one's lived there.
There's no evidence that it's part of a grand conspiracy that she disappeared. She disappeared, to her friends, in a prosaic way. Just that the real reason for her disappearance, moving house and location at short notice, was not conveyed to everybody at the school or the kids or her friends.
Why wouldn't she tell everyone that she's moving? Especially after that happens.
I'm not an authority on that, and it's purely for private. I'm sure it's got nothing to do with UFOs. Yeah, it was entirely prosaic reasons.
Yeah.
So it's not part of the story of some sort of dark intrigue going on there. I think it's a bit of there's no point trying to flog that particular story. It's been explained relatively well.
Out of all there's some big UFO cases, abduction stories.
Yep.
Which do you think it holds the most weight? You've got the likes of Travis Walton. You got the likes of the Betty and Barney Hill story. Which of these do you think holds its weight the most? Because there's a lot of bullshit out there, and there's a lot of people that claim they saw / got abducted, but they're just making shit up.
It's very difficult to tell. Every high-profile story gets its supporters, but also gets its critics.
Yep.
Big time.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes with Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton. One of the cases that's getting a lot of coverage at the moment, and it certainly caused a lot of attention for me at the time, was in 1973 in October, massive UFO wave across America. And one of the events that caught worldwide public attention, this was a truly worldwide story, was the abduction of Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker down in Mississippi at Pascagoula.
Yeah, right. I haven't heard of this.
Yeah, well, there's a 4-part documentary series put together on that case, well worth looking at.
Yeah.
Based on research from Philip Mantle, English researcher. He's started looking into it. The more he looked at it, the more he realised there was so much there that hadn't been properly documented. And the story was that nobody witnessed their abduction. Well, it turned out there were other people that had been allegedly abducted as well, and other people that saw stuff happening at that wharf area where they claimed to have been abducted. But the beings involved were very unusual. They were not your grey types or Nordics. They were kind of very wrinkled skin with what appeared to be like horns or cones coming out where the ears were and the nose, no apparent eyes, all just wrinkled skin. And the reports were like, and they had hands like crabs. That was really, really bizarre report. But check it out. It's really an interesting. So I've been fascinated by the case. So when I went to the one and only MUFON conference, where I was invited to give a presentation in Washington, D.C. on the Australian UFO military experience in 1987.
Calvin, bring a microphone close.
Yeah, Calvin Hickson was there. So I got to meet him briefly. He passed away several years later, but Calvin Parker, who was much younger than him, he seemed to be like a footnote in the main story at the time, and it was like the word was that he'd had a breakdown and dropped out. Just didn't want that kind of attention. You could see what was happening to Charlie Hickson, the older guy, getting a lot of flack and a lot of support. When you put your head up, you're going to get coverage. These days, it's I generally recommend to people, unless you really got lots of gumption and resilience, don't put your head up on a UFO story unless you truly want to promote the cause of it and all that kind of stuff. But because there are so many, you look at any story, say for example on YouTube or X or whatever. You've got your the claim, the story, positive feedback, but a whole stack of endless kind of people that most of the time they don't seem to have in-depth knowledge of the case. They're just arguing from a belief system. Can't be real, therefore it's bullshit. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's no way to look at a subject. If you don't have any knowledge on a subject, don't trumpet your lack of knowledge because it's pretty blatant that you don't bugger all about the case, that kind of thing. It's best to argue from the point of view of having a lot of knowledge. What I referred to previously as the deep dive. Check out your facts. Dig into it. And the opportunity for the Pascagoula case, Philip Mantle and others have done the hard yards and spent years getting all the original material. And I think he's done a pretty good job of putting together, and there's been a number of books. And they finally, Calvin Parker, who, as I said, had apparently had a breakdown, couldn't handle what happened. He was like a deer caught in the spotlight, just didn't want to know about it. He wanted out of there. Didn't want to be the center of attention. Eventually, it really preyed on him a lot. Eventually, he reckons it affected him badly.
Wasn't that the case with Betty Hill as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But, that became a very famous case. But with Calvin Parker, he went on to write his own book. And there's been Philip Mantle and company, they've written a number of books about the Pascagoula case. So if you want a detailed look at an abduction case, take a look at the Pascagoula case. Definitely worth your time. And the easy initial entry, and I say this is initial entry stuff, you need to really do the deep dive on this case, is the 4-part documentary series, which I think was on the main, what's the main downloading site? Not YouTube, whatever it is anyway. Just put it into Google, you'll find it for you.
Yeah.
It's a 4-part thing on UFO abduction at Pascagoula.
Yeah, well, check it out.
Definitely worth looking at.
Check it out. What do you think about Bob Lazar? We haven't really dove deep into Bob Lazar, and that's someone who I've been following for years.
Yeah, Bob Lazar is an interesting character.
Do you think he's telling the truth?
I don't have any direct proof myself other than what people tell me.
Because I also saw when I was looking into yourself, I noticed you've linked up with George Knapp before.
Yeah, George came to Australia to give a presentation on Skinwalker Ranch in particular.
Yeah. He
talked about Bob Lazar and, he wanted to get out of the conference area and said, you want to come for go for a drive along the beaches, northern suburbs, and we'll try and have a drink at every beach or whatever. Yeah. And so we went off and did that journey across the northern beaches and onto the southern beaches. And eventually, later on, they were wondering where we were. So we ended up at the Koala Bear Park just near Pennant Hills.
Yeah.
So we got to see wildlife there, Australian wildlife up close. And, a really nice guy, George, and I've been on his show a few times and that kind of stuff. And I remember once he said, just in the interest of transparency, Bill and I go back a long way. He's got some incriminating photographs of me. And I'm thinking, what the hell is he talking about? It turned out to be the photographs I took of him in the Koala Bear Park, doing things with Indigenous wildlife. So he's a nice guy, very nice guy, a good solid researcher. And he's getting a lot of kudos at the moment for a lot of the hard research that he's done over decades. And one of those stories, is the Bob Lazar story. And we were talking about that as we wound our way down the north side beaches, etc. And he seems to feel that it's fairly legit. There are parts of the story he's not so sure about.
Yeah.
The fact that he was able to track down.
So George Knapp doesn't he doesn't like fully believe every single thing that Bob Lazar
Yeah.
says. There's some
That's
things.
right. Yeah.
Well, that if there's things that you think are a bit sus, can that not kind of affect the legitimacy of the whole story?
Well, one aspect that I've always thought might be applicable here with Bob Lazar is there's some stuff in there, like he got caught up in some sort of crime thing that he was charged with aiding and abetting the establishment of a brothel or something locally, and all he was doing was just setting up the electronics and security. So not a big deal, I guess. Yeah. But there was evidence that we couldn't find any evidence for him being there. But since then, there have been people come forward to say, yes, he was there. Now, we've only got his evidence to support what he actually claims to have seen through a window and all that kind of stuff, and seeing the craft and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and the nighttime sort of launch of something. So it's all become apocryphal stuff. But it's an interesting story. I just don't know. It's one of those things that I'm like George, it looks like there's something there to it. And
well, his story has stayed pretty consistent since the 80s or whenever. When he first came out, it was George Knapp that leaked his story, right? Or leaked, like he gave the spotlight. Yeah. He put the spotlight on Bob Lazar.
Yeah.
And since then, Bob Lazar's story has stayed pretty consistent.
Yeah, well, I was on a computer network system before the World Wide Web became a big thing, and it was Paranet. And Paranet was kind of this computer setup that was being used by a lot of computer nerds to link with people of like minds around the world kind of stuff. And so that applied also to UFOs. There was this network worldwide before the World Wide Web of researchers exchanging thousands of pieces of data with everybody around the world. It was a great way to do research, You put a message on there, anybody out there got something on such and such and such and such? And then a day later, comes into your little inbox. This is all before email.
Yeah.
It was a great way to get data. And then that just got strengthened big time through the advent of the internet. But now it's kind of like overload problems now. Like there's just too much there. And there's a lot of people out there that set themselves up as instant experts that, I've got to be honest, they know bugger all, and it becomes patently obvious, like if you do your homework. But if you're only looking at it in a superficial way, everybody's an expert, So it's there's only a handful of good, solid sort of outlets of information, and the rest is a bit of a circus, part of what I call the UFO theatre, like lots of carry-ons and debates and controversies, and you learn to just ignore most of that most of the time, because it's not a ready pathway to knowing more about the phenomenon itself. Better do the field work, do the investigations, and that leads you into knowing a lot more about the subject. Yeah. You don't get total answers, but you certainly get an understanding of what's real and what's not, just through sheer experience, I think.
So one of the things that Bob Lazar has stayed consistent with was a fingerprint reading technology. It was like it read the bone structure in your hand or something like that. Right. And you could use that to get into S4. Like you'd have to put your hand on this reader, and it would read your bones or whatever.
Right.
And he stayed true with that. He stayed consistent, with that story over the years.
Well, here's a story for you, and this comes out of the deep dive. During 1967, there was an amazing UFO encounter that occurred at a remote place in Western Australia, and it was, I think, a shearing contractor, Sprago, I think was his last name, well respected in the area, and he's driving along a country road. Object appears, and it seems to project a slow progression solid beam. Something I'm interested in personally, of what has become known as solid light cases. This is a classic example of it, where this what appeared to be like a solid light tube is projected from the object down into the car. His car seems to be virtually taken over, and he's got about 5 minutes or more of missing time, and the clock, his watch is affected, and then it's as if suddenly it's switched off. Object leaves, and the car's still moving at high speed. And he reports it to the locals and goes to the police. And this is where a lot of the information comes from, was from an official police report. And it's clear that they regarded him well. But what's not known is that it took decades later, but that same location 10 years earlier was the scene of what is referred to as a major poltergeist outbreak of falling stones and stone projectiles, really weird apparitional kind of stuff going on, and min light type phenomena going on at that time 10 years earlier.
Yeah.
But a woman who was married into the family of the main people or some of the main people in that location, she wrote a book about the poltergeist outbreak from the late 50s. And in there's an anecdote, a story that she describes from a local farmer that took place a decade later on the same night, lit at the same time as Sprago, the sheep contractor's having his solid light experience only a few kilometres away. The farmer is woken up and his dogs are really violently barking at something, and he's got these mammoth-looking dogs, You wouldn't want to argue with them. But he goes out on the veranda and suddenly he's overwhelmed with this massive light beam coming straight down onto him, and he's immediately so bright that he puts his hands up and he can see through his hands. He can see the veins of his hands. And he's up there and he's kind of paralysed. He can't move. And then it switches off. And the noise and everything, and the dogs all calm down straight after that. That story stayed hidden for decades. It was only known amongst family people until this woman wrote the book about the falling stone poltergeist outbreak 10 years earlier.
Mm.
So here we have confirmation of that was never found until decades later of Sprago's account that was investigated by the local police, and the report ended up in the RWF archives. I think the explanation, though, kind of went with psychological.
Psychological.
Yeah.
He was tripping.
No, not tripping, but something happened, But
how have they explained that entire case is just psychological?
Well, we don't look into it too deeply. That's the way to explain it.
Mm.
Yeah. And if you don't want to leave it as an unexplained case, you come up with the caveat of psychological. Some sort of, like in isolation, you could have argued maybe it was like a driving paralysis. If you drive long enough and far enough, you zone out.
Mm.
And you have these truck driver stories where, I've just driven 1,000 kilometres and frankly, I can only remember about 20 kilometres of the trip. You're thinking, Jesus, I hope you're awake for longer in that trip, But it's true that some people forget parts of their trip, But they probably were awake. You'd hope they were awake. But I remember investigating a case up on the Ebor plateau of a truck driver driving, and he's telling me he had this experience, but he says, to be honest, it happened in the middle of a episode where I cannot remember what I was doing over 100-kilometre range. I cannot remember it. But in the middle of it was this UFO event.
Yeah.
And thinking, well,
that would stand out, wouldn't it?
It would, yeah, definitely stand out. And the idea of a truck driver driving unaware of his environment, you're kind of thinking, he's in automatic. And if you're spending so much time there, you're focused on driving, and anything outside that
That definitely happens. I feel like I drive past speed cameras sometimes.
Oh yeah,
and then
you don't want to do that too often.
because I know to slow down for the speed camera, but then I'll kind of just zone out and go automatic, as you're saying. Then a little bit later, I'm like, fuck, did I speed or what? I can't remember.
Yeah, you'll get a reminder in the mail.
Yeah. Look, before we wrap this up, I also want to ask about your experience as the New South Wales representative of APRO.
Right.
And you were also the Australian representative of MUFON.
Yeah, well...
So just explain your experiences in both of those organisations for me, and, some of the craziest things that you came across.
Yeah, well, to be honest, with the wisdom of hindsight, I think I've functioned better outside of groups than within groups.
Yeah.
And with my own group, UFOIC, that's the UFO Investigation Centre, that started as a civilian, classic kind of public UFO group that we ran. I didn't get involved with it until I became a country member in the late 60s. 1969, it was like anybody that joined up became an investigator. That to me just didn't work. You've got to have experience, and you learn from experience, that kind of thing. But so I became known, involved with the UFOIC group. Its name got taken by a local group that started up in 91. It had been the UFO group, we changed it in 1976, 77 to UFO Research New South Wales to bring it in line with a lot of the civilian groups around Australia that were going with each state name. It'd be UFO Research South Australia, UFO Research North Queensland or something like that, and then UFO Research New South Wales into natural progression. Then along comes a group that gets formed in 91, which is the current group, and they call themselves, and I think somewhat deliberately, UFO Research New South Wales, and registered the name. I went along to the first meeting, and I wasn't welcome. But anyway.
Why do you think that is?
I think they felt somewhat threatened that I said, I'm just here to check out what's happening to a group. It suddenly registered the name that we've had for... Up to that point, that was 91, we named the group, our group renamed it till in 76. So you're talking a long period of time that we were operating, but not as a public group. We deliberately changed it to a low-profile research group. We were done with, we thought we'd done enough public liaison and public relations. We wanted to just do research, and that's what we did. So we had a loose network, and that worked really well. But we did it. We weren't interested in publicity. We just wanted to do the research, and when we felt we had something worthwhile, we'd publish it. And we thought that's a much better research model to go with. But along comes a group of people. They start this group in 91. I can understand it up to some point that they thought that the UFO Research New South Wales was no longer active. Well, they just didn't ask. And we were active. But we just weren't active to the level of being in the public eye all the time.
Yeah.
We just didn't want to be, deliberately. And then so I turn up at the first meeting, and they seemed to be a bit paranoid about me turning up thinking I was going to create trouble. I said, no, I'm just here to see what's going on. And he says, well, if you don't leave, we'll call the police. And I said, do what you got to do. They call the police. And the police turn up and saying, well, who's causing all the trouble? And says, well, that guy at the back, and he's not doing anything, the police saying. He's just sitting there. He says, we want him ejected. He says, and they come up to me and said, look, they seem to be a bit touchy about me being here, and I'm just quietly sitting here, so, honest to God, officer. And they say, by the way, here's their meeting notice that says it's open to the general public. I'm the general public, part of the general public. So.
So this was not like a high level.
No, they just started their first meeting.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought this was in like the government.
Oddly enough, there's a bit of this is falls into the category of what I call UFO theatre.
Yeah. Where
it's of no real consequence to the core UFO phenomenon, the real UFO reality. It's part of the UFO theatre, and it's not worth getting too entrenched in, as far as I'm concerned. And
Right.
for me, I was happy that there was going to be a public group in Sydney doing the public thing, putting on the public meetings. I thought, great, that takes the pressure off us. We don't have to go public anymore. We don't want to be public. So off we went and did our thing. But they were really paranoid about, or seemingly touchy about having somebody from the previous group turning up on the first day of their new group. But they've gone on and done a lot of good things over the years, and but they're still pretty much doing the public UFO group model, which I think there's better ways of looking at the subject. And to me, the low-profile network concept to me has been really good for me and for the people I'm associated with privately. And I did all that RWF research. Still under the UFO. Well, by that stage, did it more privately as an individual thing, and then made it more open as we got the data and made it available. But talk about UFO politics was amazing, very toxic and draining.
Wow,
that's why I didn't want to be involved too much in UFO groups after a while. You mentioned MIFON, you mentioned APRO. Both those groups were really good. They had their own model. APRO's
the international or the?
Yeah, it was international. It was based in Tucson, Arizona. Jim and Coral Lorenzen. You find out a lot about them in books like this. There's 2-volume encyclopedia, which I'm going to plug big time.
Yeah.
This is edition 4, 1,700 pages of stuff devoted to UFOs. Now,
wow.
Think about it, like for $100 or $200, you'd spend that going out for one night at a restaurant. Spend it on getting this, because you'll be overwhelmed with the amount of information, huge, deep dive history on the subject. It's massive. And I put a lot of Australian content into that. It's a really worthwhile way of surveying the subject. But APRO was one of the earliest UFO groups, and Jim and Coral Lorenzen, and they'd published a lot of books during that period. One of them's here. One of the first to document, well, if there's UFOs flying around, there might be somebody inside them, flying saucer occupants. One of the first major surveys apart from
bodies have been supposedly recovered, right?
Yeah, that's the story. That's a familiar story that goes way back. In fact, far earlier than 1947.
Yeah,
claims of crashes of things.
Yeah.
So it's an enduring subject, but
even David Grush even said that there was living organisms as part of what he was part of.
With a person with a science background like me, I'm saying, oh, well, that's an interesting story. Show me the evidence. I'd love to see the evidence.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any evidence.
Well, evidence is going to be hard to come by with.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
The only thing that worries me a bit about the Mussolini UFO crash at Magenta in 1933 is that 2 weeks earlier, in 1933, there was a mysterious aerial crash that occurred in the same general area up in the northern part of Italy.
Right.
But it turned out it was the crash of an early Australian aviation pioneer, and that was Hinkler, one of the famous flyers. And he was trying to do a flight from England to Australia, but came to grief in northern Italy and crashed and died, and was given eventually, they found the crash site, wondered what it was, and turns out to be the crash of Hinkler's aircraft. And he was an aviation pioneer and hero in Australia, but sadly came to grief, and was given eventually, when they figured it out who it was, and that it was Hinkler and his plane that had crashed. He was given a full state funeral honouring him as a pilot by Mussolini.
Yeah, wow.
And then his body got taken back eventually to Australia, and he's buried in Australia. So I think to the best of my knowledge, yeah. Amazing story. But, yeah. So I wondered in the back of my head, a crash of a mysterious object and then a body found 2 weeks before the alleged date of the magenta thing. Is there something going on there? Is it a misinterpretation? Because there's still a big bum fight going on between, as I said originally, between the more conservative, evidence-based UFO researchers and the more broader, open kind of public researchers like Robert Pagnotti, who I met in 1987 in Washington, D.C. Did the magenta crash happen? They had no knowledge about the magenta crash until all these mystery documents started surfacing back in the either late 80s or 90s. I can't remember when.
Well, didn't they? I thought with the crash in Magenta, one of the popes got their hands on it. The Pope at the time.
Part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, the story grew, and that seems to be the way, allegedly, if the story is factual, that it got into the hands of the American military intelligence sort of apparatus, and then eventually makes its way to the United States to become now a rather apocryphal but interesting and a fascinating story. Now, it may well be true. I don't know. To me, I'd like to see a lot more hardcore evidence for it, not just stuff based on these documents. Now, Ross and others, other researchers seem to have managed to dig deeper. He's talked to Grush, but I don't know the detail of what is the extent of the evidence, and I'm kind of hoping it's more than just a recycling of the Italian UFO researcher story. I'm hoping it's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Maybe it is. But I don't know whether there's confirmation of this in the Vatican archives. Some people argue that there is, but we're not seeing it yet.
Yeah.
We're based largely on the stories coming via David Grush and the Italian research documents, the Magenta documents, which again, as I have to stress, are subject to a lot of debate on their authenticity.
Yeah.
They're seen as the Italian version of the MJ12 documents, like a whole bunch of documents. A lot of people claim that they're not authentic. Others say that they are. So it's a lot of research yet to go on. But if David Grush and company have got detailed documentation that's Vatican-based and authentic, love to see it. Would really love to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Bill. Well, thank you very much for coming in here.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It's been very good, very interesting.
Good.
Appreciate your time.
Yeah, and good luck with your podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much, mate.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll certainly give it a plug.
Yeah, yeah, plug it. Plug it the same way you plug these books.
Yeah, plug these. Get these books, yeah. Whatever.
All right, mate. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries.